Our scripture this morning is found in the book of Joshua. It's the book of Joshua, chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so every man charged straight in, and they took the city.
601,730 fighting men ready to go. 23,000 priests and Levites ready to lead the way. If you had that kind of force, those kind of numbers, those on your side, how would you go about attacking a large and heavily fortified city? If you had that huge of an army, what kind of options would you be thinking about? I mean, this is an important decision. Jericho had been singled out as the first place to be conquered by the invading Israelite army. Their overall goal was to take the whole land, but they had to start someplace, and this was the place. And so these 601,730 fighting men, and yes, they counted them, men who had already seen battle and had been overwhelmingly victorious, wiping out whole kingdoms of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, and taking over their whole territory east of the Jordan River. Men who were in peak physical condition and ready to go. These men were looking to Joshua to find out what the plan was going to be. Was it going to be a frontal assault? Just attack the gates and overwhelm the whole city by their sheer numbers? Or maybe a sneak attack, just have a few of their strongest go in after dark and get over the walls and then open the gates and let the whole army into the city. They'd never know what hit them. Whatever the plan, they were ready to go. And so when Joshua stood before his whole army, all the fighting men, all the priests, and he laid out the plan for taking the city, they were all ears. He told them right up front that he had gotten this plan directly from God. In fact, God had actually shown up in person to tell Joshua exactly how he wanted the Israelites to pull off this most important of all battles. In the morning, they would get into a huge circle that went all the way around the whole city, which would look pretty intimidating from the top of the city's gates and walls, because there would be Israelites several ranks thick, every direction, wherever you happened to look. And then they would slowly move around the circle, around the city in a circle, with the Ark of the Covenant leading the way, with the 7 of the priests continuously blowing these loud, shrill notes on the ram's horn trumpets. And then as soon as they finished that lap all around the city, they would return to camp for the night. I can imagine it sounded just like that when Joshua told the people. But that's okay. They were still listening. After all, Joshua was their leader. He had gotten this plan from God, and this wasn't the first time that God had come up with a plan that sounded a little weird at first. And so Joshua went on. They would march around the city once each day with ram's horn trumpets blaring away. And then on the 7th day, get this, they were going to march around the city 7 times. And then at the end of the 7th lap, the priests would blow a long blast on their trumpets. All the people would give a great shout, and when they all shouted, the walls were just going to fall down flat so that the soldiers could go straight into the city and totally destroy it and everything in it and everybody in it. That was the plan. That was exactly how they were going to knock down the massive 25-foot tall, 20-foot thick walls of Jericho by marching, blowing trumpets, and shouting. That was the plan. So what did they think of it? Well, this is the sixth message in our series, Take the Land. A look at the first 8 chapters of Joshua, looking at how the children of Israel were given the impossible mission of capturing and occupying a 300,000 square mile chunk of land filled with giants and huge walled cities. And in the process, seeing how God helped them to make that vision a reality. As I have said repeatedly throughout this series, that it is critical for our congregation to understand this right now, because just like the Israelites, God has actually given our congregation a mission that might seem impossible to some people. And that mission is to make Christ-like disciples of the people all throughout the greater Woodburn area. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens, hundreds even. And through the experiences of Joshua and the Israelites' conquest of the Promised Land, we are learning some important lessons about how God can help us to make that vision a reality as well. We started by seeing that when God gave the children of Israel the mission of taking the Promised Land, He actually gave them a lot more than just the mission. He also gave them all of the power that they were going to need to to complete the mission. And He gave them the promise of His presence all the way to the finish line. But there were 3 conditions they had to meet if they were going to make those promises a reality. The first was they had to be strong. That means they had to be willing to put their back into whatever God told them to do. They had to be courageous, willing to move forward immediately whenever God gave them the word. And finally, they had to be holy, completely obedient to God in everything that He commanded them to do. Then we saw how God showed the people that He had actually gone ahead of them in this endeavor, terrifying the current residents of the land before they even got across the Jordan River. Then we saw how God brought the Israelites into the land by a mighty miracle, drying up the Jordan River, even though it was running at flood stage at that point, and allowing all 1.5 million Israelites to walk across on dry ground. Then we watched how God worked with the Israelites to ensure that they would be able to pass on their faith to the next generations. To those who hadn't seen the miracles themselves, but who would be able to hear about it through the memorials and rituals that God Himself set up. And then 2 weeks ago, we looked at the importance of getting our plan of attack from God Himself, instead of just relying on our own human reasoning and resources. God's plans are nearly always counterintuitive, but they always work if we're willing to follow them to the letter. So, once you have a plan, how do you make it real? How do you work with God to pull off something that seems absolutely impossible? To be perfectly honest with you, and if you're taking notes in your, we have the yellow sermon note sheets in your bulletin, this is the first blank to fill in. To be perfectly honest, God's plan really did sound kind of impossible. It wasn't a plan that any military strategist would ever come up with. They would recommend things like battering rams and catapults and siege ramps and things like that. Marching around a city might be a good way to intimidate the enemy walled up in the city, shake them up and take a little bit of the fight out of them. But when it came to actually attacking the walls, trumpet blasts and shouting, even 600,000 people shouting, wasn't going to make even a small dent in all of those walls. I mean, at that point, those walls have been standing for over 1,000 years. In spite of earthquakes and rain and wind, they were strong. And now they were going to attack these walls with marching and trumpets and shouting? Now, you got to give the Israelites credit here. As I said before, they had watched God do some pretty spectacular stuff, and He had always come through exactly as promised. And so, instead of thumbing their noses at God's plan, instead of just walking off in disgust, they were all in. The next day, they were all assembled as they walked the 2 miles to the city. Over 620,000 people, soldiers and priests, all ready for the day's march. They circled up all around the hill on which Jericho was built. 9 acres it covered. So it took a good big-sized circle to go around it, but there were lots of them. So they were not only around the city, they were several ranks wide as they stood around there. They totally surrounded it on every side. The gold-covered Ark of the Covenant was right at the head of the group, with guards at front and back of it. 7 priests with 7 ram's horns walking alongside of the ark, and at Joshua's signal, the trumpets began to blow, and the people started to move forward. Just this big circle kind of turning as the people walked slowly forward. Now I can imagine the people of the city starting to gather up on the wall to watch this weird procession with awe and wonder. They could see that there were enough soldiers out there to totally overwhelm them if they could ever get past the walls. And I'm sure they fully expected them to suddenly rush the walls, maybe with battering rams, or maybe just trying to climb up them. Maybe they would build siege ramps that would eventually reach the top of the walls. And I'm sure they were ready with bows and arrows and spears to pick off anybody who got within range. But they were outside of the range of all of their weapons. But they didn't rush the walls. They just kept marching around the hill, just out of range of their spears and arrows, with those trumpets blaring for an hour or so. And then all at once, the trumpets stopped blowing, the people stopped marching, and then they just walked away back toward their camp. Can you imagine the look on the faces of the soldiers of Jericho? What was that all about? That was just weird. And the next day, there they were again. All those soldiers and priests marching around the city one time, blowing those trumpets, and then the trumpets stopped blowing, and they all stopped walking, and then they just all walk away and walk back to camp. 6 days in a row, the same thing. This was getting ridiculous. I imagine that everybody in Jericho was just about at their wits' end. All those soldiers, they were just teasing them. And then the dead silence, they all just walk away. It was unnerving, which I think was probably a big part of God's plan. Finally, the 7th day came. And everybody was up and moving just as the sun was peeking up over the horizon. This was the big day. This was the day that God was going to deliver Jericho into their hands. This was the day that they were going to make their first conquest in the Promised Land. This was the day that God was going to officially make the impossible real. The directions for that day were a little different. They were to march around the city just like always, with the Ark of the Covenant leading them and the trumpets blaring. But today they were to go around the city not just once or twice, but 7 times. When the trumpets stopped sounding, they were all to stand still, just like normal. But then the priests were going to blow a long blast on the trumpets, and when all the people heard that long, loud blast, they were to all yell at once, and God promised that when they all shouted, that the walls of the city were going to fall down flat. Now, it's important to remember that Jericho, just like all the rest of the Promised Land, was inhabited by people who had turned their backs on the Lord. They refused to acknowledge Him as their God, and they chose instead to worship gods that they had created themselves. It's not that they had never heard about the true God. I mean, all these folks were descendants of Noah through his son Ham and his grandson Canaan. They had come to this part of the world after God had confused the languages of their ancestors at Babel. God was able to stop their rebellion against Him by confusing the languages, but He hadn't been able to get rid of the rebellion in their hearts. They continued to rebel against Him in the new land that they'd colonized as they began to make idols and worship them. Now, when God spoke to Abraham and promised to give him this land, He told them that he couldn't have it right away. In fact, Abraham wouldn't get his own land at all. The land would be his great-great-grandchildren's. It would be them who would take over the land. In Genesis 15, when God made His covenant with Abraham, He told him this, and this is in your notes. Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. And that happened when they went to Egypt and were enslaved for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. That also was literally fulfilled when they came out of Egypt with all the gold and silver. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. See, the Amorites, that included all the people who were currently living in the land, were people who were in rebellion against God, even in the days of Abraham. And one of the cool things about God is that He isn't stuck in time like we are. See, we have to experience time one moment at a time. We can't go forward, we can't go backward. But God, He kind of sits above the line of time. And at any given moment, He can look all the way back to the beginning of the universe. And He can look all the way forward to the day that the universe will be destroyed. And He can see them all at the same time. And God, He looked at those Amorites, and He knew that their rebellion against Him was huge. And it was terrible. But right at that moment, when He was talking to Abraham, God could see that there was still a chance that some of them, even if it was only one or two, would still seek after Him. And because of that one slim chance that still existed, He wasn't willing to destroy them at that time. See, that's God's love and mercy at work. But He could also look forward and see that in 400 years, at the time the Israelites will be coming into the land from Egypt, that the sin of the Amorites would be at its full measure. At that time, they would all be so bad that none of them would ever turn away from their idols and their wickedness and seek to know Him. And at that point, when all the hope of ever redeeming them was gone, then He would be willing to destroy them. And He would use the Israelites as His tool to do just that. And that's the reason for His instructions to the Israelites. Instructions that seem cruel and heartless to some people. And that is that every living thing in the whole city should be put to the sword. Men, women, children, animals, all of it. And like I say, that seems cruel to some people, but they don't get that God put off His judgment of these people for 400 years until He knew for sure that any hope of them ever turning to Him was totally gone. And so that was their instruction. Every living thing in the city was to be put to the sword, except Rahab, who had hid the spies, and her family that she had gathered together in her house. They could be spared. Now remember that her house could be identified because she tied a red rope in the window that she let the spies out of. And that's how they would know which one was her. There's her house right there. And so they would be able to go in and they would help her to escape. Now, the Israelites had promised her that they would keep her and protect her. And God always requires that His people keep their promises. Now, the Israelites were also supposed to take all of the precious metals out of the city, the gold and the silver and the bronze, and bring it out of the city and put it into the treasury of the Lord. They could not loot the city for their own personal gain. That wasn't allowed. None of the stuff in there belonged to them. It all belonged to God. And after they were done, everything else was to be put to the torch. The whole city was supposed to be burned to the ground, which was going to be a sign to the people all over the land of what happens to people who rebel against the God of the universe. The guards on top of the walls of Jericho noticed that the Israelites were gathering a little earlier than normal that day, just after sunup. But other than being ahead of schedule, everything else looked pretty much the same. They all formed their line. They all started to move as the trumpets started to blow. But after they'd gone around the city, instead of the silence, the horns kept sounding and the people kept moving. Once, twice, 3 times. I imagine at that point the guards sent word to the king that something weird was going on here. This was not the normal pattern. 4 times, 5, 6, and still the people were moving, and still those horns were blowing. By now, all of the people were probably in the streets or on the wall trying to figure out what was going on and what was going to happen next. All except one small group of people who were gathered in a house that was built right into the wall. A group of people watching this spectacle through a window that looked out over the countryside past a red cord that was waving in the breeze. 7 times the army of Israel marched around the city to the monotonous sound of these ram's horns. And then all of a sudden, silence fell. All the soldiers stopped in place, all of them facing the city. For several seconds, nobody moved. Not among the circle of soldiers and priests, not among the soldiers standing on the walls of the city. The silence was so thick you could practically feel it. And then a single voice cried out on the plain, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the cities." The trumpets blew a long, sustained blast, and 620,000 voices rose in unison, a unison shout that filled every heart in Jericho with panic. And the army of Israel began to move straight in toward the city. At that same moment, the walls began to move and to shift and to shake. Those invincible walls that for centuries had withstood every attack, every earthquake, every blast of wind and rain actually began to collapse in on themselves. And within seconds, they were all laying flat on the ground. The whole city fell into mass confusion as the army of the Lord reached and easily climbed up on the rubble that minutes before had seemed like an impregnable barrier. And within just a couple of hours, every living thing in the city was destroyed, except Rahab and her family, who, true to their word, the spies had rescued. And by the end of the day, a smoking pile of ruins, surrounded by the rubble of those destroyed walls, was all that remained to show that there had ever been a city there. God had made the impossible real with his ridiculous plan. He had fulfilled his promise to give them the city, and at the same time prove to the Israelites and to us that it is not by our might, not by our power, but by the might and power of God himself that we are able to win the victory over impossible situations. Now I can imagine the huge celebration that night in the Israel camp at Gilgal. The singing, the repeated tellings of the battle and the victory to the women and children who had stayed behind in the camp. They must have been really riding high. But I think that if we could have been there, we would have noticed that Joshua was strangely silent. He was thinking, probably praying. See, this was an important victory. A huge success by anyone's estimation. But this wasn't the end of the war. This was only the first battle. The war was just beginning. Now, he understood very clearly that the Israelites had been commanded to take Jericho. They hadn't been commanded to just take Jericho. They had been commanded to take the whole land. 300,000 square miles. And so far, they had taken approximately 9 acres. This was a night for celebration, a night for rejoicing and giving glory to God for what he had done for his people. But tomorrow, he knew very clearly that the real work was going to begin. Tomorrow, they were going to have to start fighting the rest of the war. The bottom line is this. There is a normal psychological cycle that goes along with times of victory. There's a time of celebration, immediately followed by a time when we kind of let down a little bit. We take a few deep breaths and pat ourselves on the back, which is all good. And then we figure that we owe ourselves a rest. The problem is, if we simply kick back and rest, we quickly lose our motivation to move on to the next battle and the next victory. We quickly settle back into our normal routines, our normal mindsets, our normal everything. And the victory soon becomes a fond memory that we look back on a little wistfully. Remember when? See, Joshua understood this. And he moved quickly to keep his people in war mode. He reminded them that the war had only begun. There were still almost 300,000 square miles to be conquered, and he immediately focused them on the next objective, the little fortified town of Ai, about 12 miles north of Jericho. That was the next spot where battle was going to take place. Short time to celebrate, then on to the next objective. Last Sunday, we got to experience firsthand what God can do when we seek Him first and tell Him and follow what He tells us to do. We invited people and we prayed. We delivered cookies to businesses and we prayed some more. We sent out invitations and we put posters up and we prayed. And we published a story in the newspaper. And did I mention that we prayed? All in all, during our 5 days of prayer the week before Easter, we had over 86 hours of prayer going up to the throne of God. Prayer that was directly aimed at drawing people to our church for Easter and helping them to open their hearts to the message of salvation, to receive Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And because we followed God's leading, because we invited people, because we made the whole thing in prayer, seeking to hear God's will and asking Him what He wanted us to do, we had a marvelous Easter with an amazing number of people joining together. We had 119 people here Easter Sunday morning. They joined together to see our presentation and to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord. And we had 2 new people come to know the Lord for the first time. And all of that is really something to celebrate. The battle has been fought, and we watched as God brought us victory. But just like the Israelites, we always need to remember that that was only the first battle. The war has yet to be fought. We haven't been commanded to have one amazing Easter service, or even to introduce 2 new people to Jesus. We've been given the awesome job of bringing the good news about Jesus to everyone within 10 miles of our sanctuary, of telling the more than 40,000 unchurched people living within that 10-mile radius about what Jesus has done for us and what He wants to do for them, of taking Jesus into our neighborhoods and communities and bringing unbelievable numbers of people into the kingdom, men and women, prime-timers, adults, youth, kids, and even whole families, to make such a powerful difference in our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities that the kingdom of heaven grows powerfully and that we really drive the devil nuts. So far, we've made a really good start, but it's only a start. I'll tell you a few places where we're going to be working out God's plan in the next few weeks and months. This summer, we are going to do a 2-day vacation Bible school. It's a Friday and Saturday vacation Bible school. And we are going to not do it here at the church. We are going to take it into 3 different neighborhoods around here. One of them is going to be across the street into that neighborhood. One of them is going to be down in Jervis. And I don't know exactly where the third one is going to be. But in July and August, we are going to be taking the good news of Jesus into the communities. And over 2 days, we're going to show these kids about our Jesus. We're going to take over a whole park and just invite all the kids who live in those areas. And we're going to need a lot of people to help us to share our Jesus with these kids. Now, this is an opportunity for you. Remember I told you later on we'd do something with the connection cards? If you would be willing to help out, or even if you just want to get more information about this VBS, would you take your connection card and on the back of it, right down here where it says comments and prayer requests, or anywhere on there, write VBS. Write it big so that we can make sure that we see it. We will get you more information. We're going to need people to help us to fight those battles and to win people for Jesus. Now the weather's gotten a little bit nicer. And hasn't the weather been gorgeous? Whew. I have started prayer walking the streets of Woodburn. In fact, Alex has gone with me the last several times. Been having a good time prayer walking. It's kind of a fun thing. He's actually found that it's a lot more fun than you thought it would be, right? My goal, my pledge this year, is to walk every single street in the whole city of Woodburn before the end of the year, praying God's blessing on every home and business that I pass, and looking for opportunities to connect with people who live and work in those homes and businesses so that I can tell them about our church and, if possible, tell them about our Jesus. Now, a few weeks ago, I received a few connection cards from a few of you indicating that you want to go with me when I prayer walk the neighborhood you live in. Now, you don't have to prayer walk a whole long time. I may walk 2 or 3 hours in your neighborhood. I frequently do it for an hour at a time. But if you just want to help me walk up and down the streets, your one street, that's fine. Whatever you can do is good. But this week, if you put in a connection card, I'm going to be contacting you in order to set up a time when we can walk your neighborhood. Okay? I've already made that commitment to the people who already turned in a card. But if you didn't turn in one of those cards and you would be willing to prayer walk with me in your neighborhood, I'd like you to look on your connection card. In the upper right corner, there's 5 things up there. And by the way, you can check any of those boxes you want. But the one that I'm really interested in you checking right now is the 4th one down that says, I'm interested in prayer walking with Pastorwill. And the